everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Faisal. I'm the founder and CEO of Pi Labs. We're a London-based Proptech VC with over 50 investments across Europe. And today I'm really pleased to announce that we've released our latest research white paper on a very topical subject, the future of work. The paper itself is 30 pages, but I can summarize a key conclusion that we arrive at, that the future of work and the office will be centered on the following guiding principles: flexibility, transparency, health and well-being, sustainability, community, and digital services. We'll be discussing and debating some of these themes with our panelists today, and the house rules for my fellow panelists is that you'll be introducing yourself the first time you answer a question. So I'm going to kick off with a question for James Pellatt. And this is about tech experience and the digital experience in office spaces. This was seen prior to the pandemic as a relative nice to have, a concierge service that you provide your tenants. Talk us through your views on whether you think it's a more essential and core offering now for office landlords to provide to their tenants and occupiers.
Thank you, Faisal. I'm James Pellatt. I'm Director of Workplace and Innovation at Great Portland Estates. Thank you very much for having me. To answer your question, I think it is now more important. I think, or more realistically, it's a great opportunity. We have certainly found more engagement with our occupiers during this pandemic anyway, one of the positives that's come out of it. But anything that we can do that helps us and helps them communicate with their staff and helps them feel safer on that return to the office and allows them to engage with the building and the local community, but also to get feedback on what's happening in their buildings in terms of potentially what's happening in terms of air quality and what's happening in the local environment. All of those things are great opportunities for a landlord to be able to respond to.
And there's a point around transparency here. Like, we've had IoT devices in buildings, we've had data coming out of these different devices on the energy usage, the environmental footprint, air quality, etc. But what's really not being done at scale is giving it to the end user in a user-friendly way, because actually people care. Tenants, workers, employees care about the footprint of their building. Can you perhaps expand on how that's working out for you at one of your buildings?
So we can use our own floor and our own footprint really. So we've returned back to the workplace. Really pleased to be there. And we have before lockdown, we engaged with one of the Pi Labs stable of companies. We worked with 720 Degrees. So we put in those air quality sensors into our floors. It was just a couple of weeks before lockdown, so we've got a couple of periods to look at, but it's really helping us move with confidence. And so what we're looking at now is trialing that in some of our other buildings and seeing how you can give that transparency to those occupiers. And I think that transparency and clarity over what you were doing with data was critical anyway. It's just a key message that we emphasize, and we have found that occupiers are more willing to take up that engagement. And I think it's critical. I can't emphasize it enough how important it is not to abuse that trust. This is a great opportunity, and you don't really want to lose it. And which is why we're always clear and super transparent about what we're doing with information and why. And I think it's also important to show when things aren't going well so that you can fix them, because even an Apple device has an air quality indicator beneath the weather app, and people's perception of what's happening is the most important thing. So if you can be transparent and show that you're doing something actively to improve their lives, then that's a really important factor and opportunity.
No, thank you, James. I completely agree with everything you just said. So Victoria, I'm going to turn to you because air quality, indoor environment, things like heating, ventilation, lighting, all of these things, when taken together, actually contribute to employee mental health and wellness. And I know that's an area that you specialize and focus in. So what's your view on how office design and the digital experience in offices can help enhance tenant and worker well-being?
Yeah, thank you, Faisal. So, hi everybody. I'm Victoria Hill from PROMIND Capital. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's such a topical subject, as you said. So, you know, absolutely, there's so many ways that this can have an impact. I mean, you know, poor mental health and mental well-being really affects productivity, and the basics behind that are things like lack of focus, lack of motivation, lack of concentration, poor memory recall, overwhelm, all those things. And there's so much science that goes on behind which demonstrates the link between a physical environment and mental well-being. We also know the link between mental well-being and productivity. So it flows through that if you look after your environment, and actually now we're talking about office design, but we also need to look after the remote environment as well. You know, then you have a greater chance of increasing mental well-being and a greater chance of getting that great elusive discretionary effort, big motivation, high productivity, you know, that all the businesses would really like. And in terms of the office design, it's absolutely light is one, you know, looking at people congestion, another, you know, the tech coming around community apps within an office space, the community spaces themselves. So the office design is critical, and we only have to, we could turn to science to find the evidence, but we only have to really think about a day when we ourselves are really mentally well and really productive and motivated for whatever reason, and compare that to a day when we're not, and look at the difference between our outputs on both. And so this is where the business responsibility can come in and really help to try and facilitate that environment to allow people to be well and productive and motivated. Mm-hmm. In terms of the other ways that, you know, this physical sort of certainty can help is that, you know, your report, you know, I'm sure will allude to it, it's reducing uncertainty for people to come back into the office. So as James said, anything that you can do to help people, give them comfort to come back, you know, is really worthwhile. And one thing that the COVID-19 era has done is raise that kind of low level of uncertainty, low level anxiety that most people are feeling. And one of the ways we can combat that is just to remove uncertainty. So let people know that the building's not congested. Let people know that they're coming into an environment where you've looked after it and it's clean. Let people know that there's only a few people allowed in a lift, or whatever the data is, and really help with the return to work as well as the period when we are all back in work.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that there is this period where we're in the pandemic, and this is, I'll call it the, you know, during pandemic, pre-vaccine era. But that period may not last that long. It might be 6 months, it might be 9 months, or it might be 12 months. And from a technology investor's point of view, what we'll be looking for is technologies and companies that actually have staying power beyond becoming extremely topical for 6 months. And we believe that a lot of these trends that are coming about, the need for transparency, there's a catalyst during the pandemic, but I think there's a long-term need and want that tenants and employees will have about knowing more about their building. And the point you bring up about density inside of buildings, or, you know, potentially which elevators are being used, which ones aren't, I think that there will be an ongoing need for that type of transparency, including air quality, carbon footprint, etc.
Yeah, yeah.
Jonathan, you've spent a big part of your career developing large, complex, mixed-use schemes in different parts of the world. What's your view on offices and how offices need to change or transform in order to cater to this world of design-led, more spaces that offer more transparency and digital services, and spaces that actually get people to come back to work. Because there's this big debate happening about whether the large global home working experiment is going to take away from cities, and whether people will continue working in suburban spaces. What do you think the office needs to look and feel like, and what can developers do? Is this going to be more about repurposing spaces, or will new spaces have to be built altogether to get people out of their houses and back into cities?
Great, thanks Faisal. Well, I think you did a good job of introducing me. Jonathan Emery has worked in different parts of the world onto major mixed-use projects, including downtown CBD offices. I'm going to answer or give my view on the last of your questions, which is repurpose or rebuild. I think definitely it's a case at the moment of repurposing. A number of issues. I think there's a lot of space to come back, and I think the other burning issue around sustainability is sort of a pressure on all of us really to reuse what we have sustainably and economically. And I think the risks associated with speculative office development or part speculative office development at the moment are so great that the economic, the social, and the sort of environmental pressure is to repurpose. In terms of how developers sort of respond and sort of tech, I just wanted to call out a couple of big gaps between sort of the aspiration that we all talk about and the reality, in my experience, of what we're actually seeing from the construction and design industry. And this is sort of the gap that tech and the classic property industry needs to fill. Firstly, it's the gap between sort of the development world and the asset management world. And classically, offices are built even by REITs or investors. They're built to sell or to let, and they're still not really being designed for the ongoing management and adaptation of their performance. So all of the systems that are put in, it's the lift system and the BMS system, trying to get them to talk, to provide that data and that transparency is a mission in itself, even with open platforms. So there's a massive gap in the industry in thinking about the long-term use and the performance of these buildings. I think also there's a huge gap as well in that sort of design aspect of building performance. And I think about how long can it be before we can get buildings that actually adapt to the performance that's going on in them? So they start to self-adapt and monitor and adapt themselves rather than relying on people pulling bells and whistles. And they start to sort of learn from the feedback loop of the data of where people want to go and the lift performance. That would be a fantastic situation. The other big one, which Victoria talked so well about, is sort of the human aspect of building design and performance. And again, there's a massive gap here between the incredible intellect that's going into, health and well-being and, the complex nature of the human psychology and physical wellness and building performance. And I'm yet to see any massive link between how buildings perform physically and how people are feeling and how productive they are. In terms of the systems that manage both of those, the HR and people systems and sick days being linked to building performance, there's a huge gap there in terms of correlating that data and making any sense out of it. And the one last thing I just want to say on this in terms of how important building performance is that one of my last successes in Australia before I left was to secure the tenancy of a major international for Australia's and Sydney's tallest office building. And in the pitch that was made, we didn't talk about rent or space at all. It was all about talent attraction and how this building was going to help them attract talent. So building performance and how it's going to affect people's well-being and productivity and the brand, and to attract talent to their organization and how the building helped with that was, a key commercial impact for the developer.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jonathan. I think your point around the link or lack of link between the building performance, the physical building performance, and the HR systems to make that real link between health and wellness and building. You're right, there is a disconnect. I think that there are great products out there, like the one James mentioned he's using, 720 Degrees, that try to measure health and wellness by looking at all kinds of different factors and variables in a building, like air quality, ventilation, indoor air pollution, particulate matter, and calculating a wellness score. But I think you're right, the HR people certainly aren't looking at that and doing anything with that data that's being released and anything with that analytics. We're gonna just slightly change topic and come back. I think that mental health and well-being is a key theme here, and we'll certainly come back to it. I'd love to hear more from Victoria and others. But Tushar, one of the big trends that was already occurring prior to the pandemic was this structural shift in the office sector from conventional long leases to flexible working. And WeWork, of course, has been the poster child for that, but there's many other operators in the market that have survived or still going through a tough time, but either hopefully will survive the pandemic. What is your view on the place that flexible working will take in a post-pandemic world? And I've heard arguments both in both directions. I've heard that actually this is exactly the catalyst that this sector needed, and I've also heard that actually that times are very tough for flexible working. So you're right in the thick of it. Introduce yourself and tell us what your view is and where is this sector going?
Sure, yeah, thanks for the question, Faisal. Thanks for having me on. I'm Tushar Agarwal, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of HubbleHQ. We've spent the last 6 years building London's largest online marketplace to rent flexible office space. So this is something that we've been thinking about and also betting on for quite a while. I think what I'd like to separate from your questions is sort of flexible working and flexible workspaces, because actually, whilst they're linked, they're actually quite different. So just starting off with flexible workspaces. So just before the pandemic hit, in London, around 6 to 7% of total office space was flexible space. So what we mean by that is space that you don't have to let on a long-term lease basis, typically let on a license basis. Those sort of spaces would be taking on space in a WeWork or a Regus, but also taking on, say, sublet space or even any space that's been repurposed on a license contract. That was 7% in beginning of 2020. That had increased from less than 1% in 2015. And so actually that's been increasing at about 30% year on year for the past 5 to 6 years. And the industry was predicting that flexible workspaces would make up 30% of total office space by 2030. And the same industry analysts are also saying that we've seen 10 years of change in the last 10 weeks. So if you do the maths, are we now going to see 30% flexible workspace in 2020 rather than 2030? Probably not. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that with sort of the huge structural shift that we've seen in the past sort of 6 years, which has been still 30% year-on-year growth rate is still pretty high. The reason for that has been that organizations, large and small, are committing to 15 to 20-year office leases speculatively on large office units, a much more difficult decision to make. And when actually you can make a decision on a 1-year basis or a 2-year basis, and you have flexibility to change your mind very quickly, that starts to become a bit more appealing, even if you have to pay a slightly higher premium to make that decision. What we also found that is post the 2016 Brexit referendum, as that increased more and more uncertainty in the market, we started to see more small, medium-sized businesses and larger corporates come to the flexible office market that actually weren't in the market before. And that was essentially a flight to flexibility created by uncertainty. That uncertainty, the Brexit uncertainty, still exists to a certain extent about what's going to happen, by December. But that uncertainty has been increased by COVID. And then that kind of also leads me on to flexible working. So flexible working, about less than 10% businesses had fully remote workforces before, before COVID. Pretty much post lockdown, that less than 10% became over 90%. And we recently did a survey of about 1,000 employees across hundreds of small, medium-sized businesses. And the results were really interesting. The results were 70% of those really enjoyed working from home and actually found it more productive than being in the office. But actually 70% of them also still wanted an office of some sort. So what we're going to see is sort of this kind of gray area, and maybe this hybrid office become the new normal. And as an employer, if you're trying to figure out what your office footprint should be, and your office space cost is your second largest cost after salaries, you're going to start to look pretty hard at whether you can commit to a 15, 20-year space, 100,000 square feet. Actually, what you're going to start to do is maybe dip your toe in the water, get a flexible contract here, get a flexible contract there, perhaps even start subletting some of your excess space that you have because more and more people are working from home. And so what you're starting to see is a huge catalyst towards more and more flexible workspace that's driven by flexible working. And whilst, the working from home experiment has worked, and we're all, most of us, I think, are in our homes during the panel at this moment in time, and maybe it's likely to look like this whilst we're in COVID, I think the new normal will be somewhere in between, where you'll have the HQ as a central place where the company can gather. You'll still have the home as a permanent component of work, but you'll then also have a network of spaces, what we call the unbundled office, where you'll go to do specific things. So do you go to a specific restaurant or cafe to meet clients? Do you access a specific meeting room or event space to host company events? And so again, all of that requires more and more flexibility than ever before, but more importantly, what that's doing is that's really deepening the level of fragmentation in the market. And so that's going to be really hard for landlords and occupiers to match each other in real time, where the space transaction becomes more and more on demand, more and more flexible, the contracts get shorter, and they're not just making one office space decision every 10 years, they're actually making 10 decisions a week based on where their employees want to work. So for us as a technology company, as an aggregator of office space, this is probably the best thing that could have happened. We'll see, how the office market holds up, but this makes us really excited because actually technology as an enabler for liquidity in the office rental market now becomes more important than ever before.
Thank you, Tushar. You paint this picture of the disaggregated, unbundled, fragmented office. James, as one of London's well-known office providers, I'd like to get your views on the picture that Tushar has painted of how the office sector is going to evolve. And I'd love to hear from the rest of you as well. And let's stay on this topic for a few minutes.
I can't say that I disagree with a great deal of what Tushar has said. I think it is going to be a very varied market. And I definitely buy the trend that this is, accelerating trends that have already existed, and which is why we've been providing flexible space in some form, albeit not in a brand, but we've been trialing it in different parts of the portfolio for 2.5 years now. And what we found is that point of which I don't disagree that occupiers will want that choice, but I also think they don't want the hassle too, right? So I think it's a key question that you have to provide more of a service, more of a turnkey, that the space is there for them and it's easier for them to move in and then to move out of. I think the premium, there is definitely a premium to be paid for it because and that will vary depending on the level of service, location, and how good it is. But what we've also found very popular is when an organization, quite a young organization, can create their own brand and their own space that suits them, even if it's for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And when we've offered that space, actually people have been willing and are willing to take it for longer. So it's as much as we're taking away the friction and the hassle for them. Some people want to stay for a short time, that's true, but and equally we have organizations still signing leases for 15 years during lockdown. So, you know, we can see it in all parts of the spectrum. The key is to be open-minded and be able to provide solutions as they occur.
I think one of the other aspects that sort of come into play in terms of the office market and the unbundled nature is the types of space that are going to be available for office occupation. I mean, obviously, there's a classic office market, which is, you know, what we're thinking of at the moment. I think from a developer's point of view, or landlord's point of view, there's going to be a lot of space that tenants are releasing, which Tushar mentioned, definitely. And obviously this takes some time to play out, right? Because leases come up over time. It doesn't all sort of happen instantly. So that, you know, we'll start to see this happen over time. The other aspect, of course, is the new planning, proposed planning change in use, which means the change of use for all these commercial to offices, you know, whether it's, you know, it's hospitality or retail, particularly, I think is a focus of mine at the moment, how that's going to be repurposed into, you know, potentially flexible office type of environments. And obviously House of Fraser at Westfield has just announced it's being converted into offices. So we're going to see new offices pop up in different brand identities in different buildings and different locations, which I think is going to put stress on the traditional office locations and markets, in addition to sort of the changes that have driven, you know, what Tushar spoke so eloquently about.
And
sorry, Faisal.
I was actually going to turn to you, Victoria. I think there's also a different type of stress that the unbundled office brings, which is you've got teammates, some of whom are at home, others at the office, others, if, you know, Tushar's vision of the office unfolds, you've got people dotted around London. How do you maintain the sense of community, the sense of cohesion, when you're not all in the same space?
Yeah, and it's a great question. Thanks, Faisal. And you know, it's a really big challenge. So businesses now are facing lots of distance challenges. So there's obviously the physical distance between their people and operations, operational distance. But one of the other distances, which is often overlooked, is the idea of affinity distance. And by that I mean connection. So this is really around people being in a team with a sense of relatedness, a sense of belonging. And, you know, it's a really basic psychological need, and it's a prerequisite, going back to that motivation and productivity point. So without this basic need of feeling connected, it's very hard to access a productive and a motivational state. So this type of affinity distance is a real issue. And you know, businesses can do so many things, but this is where we're seeing changes in office space. I mean, some of my great clients are now going out and asking their people what kind of space they want now and what kind of space they think they're going to want in the future. So picking up on Tushar's point, which is or Faisal, I think it might have been you as well, mentioned there's a difference between, you know, this COVID-19, you're in response era, and then what's going to be the sustainable approach to the future of work. And what some of those people are saying to their business leaders, and indeed I see this in the people I coach as well, is that there are some clearly who want to be straight back into the office, and they always have done ever since the coronavirus landed. There are others who at the moment don't feel comfortable and don't want to work anywhere other than home. There's a lot in the middle who realise that actually I think they found some benefit from working at home, but they would like an office. And this absolutely plays into these kind of points, you know, what's the space going to look like? It's going to be different, fragmented, much more choice. And really businesses are going to need to adapt to satisfy their end user. You know, Tushar's point around this office market, you know, it hasn't always catered for the end user before. Jonathan mentioned it, it's been offices built to sell rather than be occupied, etc. So adapt to the end user, but also put in place the kind of technology changes that are necessary to make sure that you retain this sense of connection. And that's everything from, there's some great tech out there which is included in sort of community engagement tech. There's the transparency that we've already talked about in terms of, you know, removing uncertainty. There's data even, I think, that, you know, real-time, point-in-time data that can help leaders understand what their team are feeling on that day, even if it's just clicking a different smiley face, so that they can understand where to deploy their time and resources, who to pick up the phone to. If 9 out of 10 are great and 1 isn't, ring them first. Other opportunities, which can mean that you can have a team meeting regardless of where your people are within 2 minutes of organising. So you can either walk down the corridor, but maybe some indication of tech of where people are, just logging in each day, automatically coming through, so that you can access your people easily and retain that sense of connection, because it's so important for well-being, actually, as well as productivity. We need it to just feel good, actually, about ourselves, and clearly we need it to be able to be productive.
Thank you, Victoria. Now, I'm hearing from each of you the various tangible benefits of leveraging tech in offices and how it shapes or will shape the future of work. At what point do you think, and this is from a landlord perspective, tech will actually be a strategic advantage, where you've got building A, office building A, which is providing a suite of tech services that cater to health and wellness, transparency, community, etc. And you've got building B across the street. Is there going to be a occupancy or pricing advantage? I'd like to hear from James and Jonathan on whether that strategic advantage has started to filter through in the numbers.
It isn't, you can't quite prove it in terms of the numbers yet. I think those buildings are there today. I don't think you should definitely make that investment for a financial return. I think you should make the investment to create the space for the occupier to thrive. And I think it's for them to make that choice. And they'll just be more keen. So you get a tighter rent-free period, or you may get a bit more on the rent, but you get that desire to want to be there. Mm. And I think what we've spent a lot of time looking at this, and looking at, 2 or 3 years ago, looking at what people wanted ahead. And that meant that we shifted our focus from designing buildings to designing spaces for humans to be in, and worry less about who's going to provide the services, but make sure that they're in the spaces there. You can always work out how the service is provided afterwards. And that means that we have got those tech-enabled buildings. We are able to now sell with confidence that space that is connected, that does all of the things that you've described. Hickman opens next month, and that does all of those things and more, and gives flexibility of choice on leasing, and all of the different things that we think people want. And so I don't think your motivation should be to make more profit, although obviously that would be great if we can at the end, but I think it's more to give a better service, give a better understanding, and then I think you will outperform over time, because you're more likely to retain your occupiers. And as Jonathan said, that the new office market, I slightly disagree. It isn't entirely dead, because there's such a shortfall of supply, but the conversations that we're able to have with potential occupiers that again have carried on through lockdown are those in which we can definitely facilitate those buildings for them with a track record, and that's really, really important to be able to do that.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. My sense, I was trying to relate it to how I felt about sustainability 15 years ago when it was being introduced, and there's a lot of debate about putting sustainable solutions into buildings, and does it add value? Does it change the rent? Does it change the attractiveness? Does it change the investment, the yield profile of an office? And at that time, no one could really prove it, and people were doing it because it was sort of the right thing. There's a bit of stick from the government in terms of some of the policies that came down, but gradually people have started to do it, and essentially now I think it is demonstrated that both tenants choose sustainable buildings, and investors similarly, and will pay for that. But I think tech is probably more to the fore in terms of closer to being clearer value proposition for a landlord to invest in. One, I think, because the competitive market now is such that you have to think about value adds and certainly tech-enabled information. And as I said earlier, talent, people is the biggest cost for a business, and therefore keeping talent, attracting talent, keeping them well and productive. Therefore, any investment that you can do or a landlord can offer as part of a package of a residency affects that bottom line. So I think it's a really important point for that. Competitiveness, as we talked about, I think it is going to be a hideously competitive world as a landlord or a tenant with extra space. I think going to another point, one of the reasons why you do want physical office, and maybe for longer periods of time, is because it has, it represents your brand. You sort of want to own it. Whether it's aesthetics or a location, there's something about making it yours as your head office. And I think that sort of personalization ability that tech brings to make a space yours and communicate in a way that reflects your values and your organization, I think is another way of differentiating your space as opposed to sort of architecture or the color of the carpet or the furniture. So I think there are a few reasons why I think tech is incredibly important and high up there, I think, on the investments I would make. The only thing I would say is, as I said at the start, I think the gap between reality and currently how buildings are put together and the tech and the ability to offer these sort of seamless services is for tenants, for occupiers, for people. It's a huge opportunity still. There is a massive gap, as we know. Proptech has been so underinvested. It's huge opportunity. I think the final thing I would say, in just all aspects, and again, property comes up really badly, is sort of the service, the increase in service, the value people are put on service as opposed to the physical being. Whether it's a car, whatever it is, people want that sort of service, and therefore tech offers. It turns a building into a service, and I think that's an important value proposition as well.
I think
so go ahead, James.
Just to add to that point, I think just picking up one or two Tushar's points and then to Victoria's actually is that if people are going to be occupying buildings less or more flexibly, then actually that responsiveness about how we consume energy is going to be a critical factor. How you can link performance and temperature and cooling of a building and the amount of energy it consumes, the amount of people that are there, is really, really, really important. And I believe we've cracked that. We can do that today. It's just learning that and getting the data to feed that back. Because I think the most important thing, if we're going to be working everywhere, and Victoria mentioned it before, but I think the values of a company, if you are prepared to work flexibly in lots of different locations, how you align yourselves to the value of the organization that you're going to work in, and how they align themselves to their values in your property is the key, because that's the emotional connection that you feel, and that you do feel it's lifted the spirits of you being there. It's worth the journey of making that effort to come into that space, however much you want to do it, because it helps you do what you want to achieve and align with your own personal beliefs.
Victoria, do you want to add to that?
I really agree with so much which has been said, and I think the only thing that I would like to add is that I do see hope here that tech can really bring together the gap that has been alluded to on this call beforehand, which is between those professionals who are looking after, for want of a better phrase, the people, and those who are dealing with the bricks and mortar and everything that is far more familiar to us all. So there is this gap, and there is a huge opportunity for tech to help to measure. I mean, the tech, in the health and wellness industry, is huge. It's advanced. There seems to be an app for monitoring everything. But if we could bring some of that in via your sort of people, whether it's HR, whoever it is, aligning with people that are designing buildings, I just think there's an enormous opportunity to combine real estate and people through this tech space that could help the right professionals liaise with each other really early on. Obviously, in the case of a new build, it's right at the start of the process. In terms of repurposing, it's something that needs to morph really, and we need to find our way. I mean, Tushar mentioned a point, it was prior to this call actually, about the difference between having space that's regarded as occupational space or almost hospitality space, and that is something that I think tech can help to do and bring together the people in the real estate.
Yeah, that actually leads me on to another one of the questions I'd like you all to cover. It seems like we all are in agreement that tech is going to be an essential ingredient on the provision of office space going forward. So this is a question more around adoption. How do we scale adoption? Is it going to happen at the landlord end? So companies like James's company in GPE. Will it happen more on the tenant end? So if, for example, worker or the office group is a tenant of the landlord, are they the ones who are bringing the tech for the tenants? Or is it happening through the property and facilities managers? Just curious to hear your views on where adoption is going to scale in order to get the tech into the tenants' hands.
I think I'm happy to kick off with that one. I think right now is a particularly interesting time for adoption of technology by real estate, purely because we've been kind of forced into using it, right? We're all on a Zoom panel when we should have been in person or would have been in person otherwise. We surveyed about 60 flexible office landlords, flexible office operators in London a few weeks ago. And actually the level of technology adoption they're planning to implement in the next couple of months is staggering. It's more than whenever we've surveyed them before. It's about 10 times more than they've ever planned before. About 60% of them are planning to implement touch-free sort of access control, touch-free surfaces. About 25% of them are planning to implement sort of air filtration systems, very similar to what James was talking about earlier. And actually, I think a lot of it may be driven just by safety and hygiene. And that may be the beachhead that's needed for a lot of the landlords to see, actually, this really works, this is effective, this is what the procurement cycle looks like, this is how we buy something and implement it. And I think once that's done, that was driven by a safety and hygiene need, you will then see more of those landlords adopting technology to improve their business, improve tenant engagement, all that sort of stuff. So I think it's a really interesting time because it's kind of just driven that need for technology all of a sudden, and then we'll just become more and more used to it over time.
Yeah, I think that, so your example of touchscreen, I'd take it a little further. You want to go to tapping and keeping the distance, avoiding.
Oh, sorry, I meant touch-free, yeah.
I think there's hardware changes that will take place and software in these buildings. I mean, the last time I was in an office building, you still need to open doors, and there are so many doors you need to touch and door handles as you're moving through the building. I think a lot of that goes back to Jonathan's earlier point around repurposing. How do we repurpose buildings to create a safer environment? And part of the solution is digital and transparency, and part of it is the hardware of the building. Jonathan, James, anything to add to what Tushar was?
So I think from our own experience, the key thing that you've got to look at for any implementation, whoever's implementing it, and I'm going to be biased and say it should be the landlord because that's what we're doing, is that it's a team effort. It cannot be in any organization. It needs. So we have. And some of them are on the call. I'm really, really proud of my colleagues in terms of what we have, our innovation champions, and they're people from each discipline of the business who are there, who've been given the freedom to investigate, respond, and comment on the technology so that help us with that implementation, because you need the critical voices, it needs the negative voices, you need to understand what the barriers are in order to make the implementation happen. And the real key for success for those drivers on those health well-being installations, as well as sustainable solutions. So things like demand logic and even to an extent things like Qflow. But those things all need at least a sustainable professional and a building operations professional, an IT professional, and myself in order to make those things happen. It isn't easy for property companies to implement Proptech, but you've got to do it as a collective. You cannot do it as an individual because it just doesn't work, I don't believe.
Yeah, James, I think, you know, and I've said this previously, that there is the people that work in the property commercial real estate sector are for the large part homogenous, you know, very similar training, you know, they graduate either from Cass or Brooks or one of the real estate schools and get an RICS qualification. So there's been a lot of kind of samey thinking. And what you're describing is pulling people from different disciplines and backgrounds, sustainability people with innovation people with tech people. And so that kind of leads me on to my next question. And Victoria, I'm going to pick on you on this one. And it's more about human capital. In order to foster the right type of innovation over the next 10 years, what does the human capital mix of a real estate company look like? Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, so thanks, Faisal. So one of the really difficult things for a company to harness is collaboration and innovation when people are remote. So this is one of the biggest obstacles that, you know, we look at. So to try and get the human capital that a business needs to be doing what it's going to be doing best in terms of innovation, they need to be providing an alternative to the office collaboration and innovation where people simply get together. So that's one thing. So in order to even get to the kind of innovation you're talking about, there's already this challenge now between remote working and collaboration. But in terms of that kind of innovation to harness human capital, one thing that's been really clear is that, going back to a previous question actually, in terms of who's going to drive this, the voice of the end user, I believe, has got louder. So I completely agree with James in it takes lots of people and lots of different professionals to put some of this in place, particularly with repurposing, you know, and with redevelopment. But businesses who were not previously listening to their people around well-being agendas, right the way through to being highly productive and effective, are now actually having to listen to their people, because remote working has sort of accentuated any problems or issues that were there, made them bigger, made them worse, and they're now having to listen. So that voice has increased. I hope that voice sort of reaches its way to all the professionals. We know that the real estate industry has to be highly collaborative to get anything done, to bring a building out of the ground. There's an immense number of people involved, an immense amount of collaboration needed, and it's highly complex. It's not straightforward. So we have to have that collaboration. And if you continue what we've done to date, and you can increase the diversity, actually, you know, that's needed in the industry, then you can really start to get some great results if you listen to that end user voice. So in terms of the innovation, you know, what's needed, it's a relatively, is it radical? I was going to say radical. I'm not sure it is radical, but it's just a listening approach, more so to the end user. And I don't know if it actually is hugely innovative. There's so many tech products which are out there already, but I think James alluded to this. One of the difficulties is integrating that into our bricks and mortar. So perhaps the innovation for now in this immediate sort of era post-COVID is more around adoption rather than innovation. And obviously in the future, once we've adopted this, once it's been integrated, once all these professionals have started to learn to work together to put this in place and make human capital really prosper, then we move on to innovation later in the years.
Thank you, Victoria. So just picking up on your point around the voice of the end user, I feel that Tushar has, or his firm Hubble has, their fingertips on the pulse of demand. in a way that not many companies in London do. Tushar, based on the data that you're generating from Hubble, what is it that the end user wants from their office? I understand that you've been collecting and analyzing this data for quite some time. Would love to hear some insights from you.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the end user has been sort of described as this homogenous being for quite a while by the property industry. And actually the diversity of the end user, I think, needs to be recognized a little bit more. And so essentially it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what everyone wants. And therefore we should just build this one thing that everyone wants. In fact, every single individual is different. And what we've seen when we've sort of surveyed, we ran the survey around people's working from home preferences, over 1,000 people. Typically their preferences and what they like to, what sort of environment they like to work in and what they prefer is hugely driven by what age they are, what gender they are, how many people they live with, what's their commute like, what sort of industry do they work in, what sort of role do they play. If they're in a sales team, the majority of people who work in sales don't want to work from home. They want to be in the office because sales is like a team sport to them. It's like being on the football pitch. And doing that, isolated at home is much more difficult. So I think what we're seeing is a huge amount of heterogeneity in terms of what occupiers want, which makes the problem even worse for the landlord side and the real estate side, because it leads to even more confusion. And the way that we like to think of this is the office space industry is sort of heading more and more towards this hotelification, more and more sort of, hospitality. And so what you're going to start to see is different brands offer different value propositions. So if you take the hotel analogy, you're going to have some office brands who want to be the Four Seasons. They want to be the 5-star hotel, super high hospitality, excellent customer service. And you'll have some specific firms who really want to buy into that. You'll then have some brands who actually become the travel lodge, right? They're no frills, they're cheap, they're budget. It is what you get, but they have really, really good locations. And you also have some firms who really want to sign up to that. And then you'll also have some, you could argue Regis and IWG kind of fill this gap. You could have sort of the Marriott or Hilton, which is a global trusted brand. It does okay, but everyone knows what it stands for, and different people will want that. So I think in general, what we're seeing, especially now in terms of how we surveyed people and what people want, is people definitely want this balance between the office, working from home and a network of spaces that they'll work from. But it definitely differs significantly by the type of company, by the type of individual and what role you do. And so therefore, as a firm, how you decide what your HQ looks like will be driven by those. And you may opt to go for the Travelodge or the Four Seasons or the Marriott, but the most important thing as a landlord or as an operator is to have one particular brand positioning and really stick to it. And that, I think that will make a lot of those brands successful. If you think about WeWork, that's basically what, regardless of what we know about WeWork's business model and corporate governance, etc., what they succeeded in was creating a brand in an industry which lacked a brand in addition to Regis. And now we're seeing, there's 500 brands across London already, and there will be more so. And I think that's okay, because that starts to address the diversity of the occupier base that we're going to see as well.
Thank you, Tushar. Anyone else like to comment on what Tushar has just said?
Yeah, I just wanted to, we started off this question, Faisal, talking about so the skills gap and the talent gap potentially, for landlords, and I think there has been an enormous shift, as there have been in many things over the last 3 or 4 months. But I think there's a massive sort of cultural gap as well for many landlords who traditionally have been, not even connected to the tenants. They've inserted agents between themselves and their customers. And now we're talking about them offering hotel concierge services. That's a huge cultural shift. Mm. And there are some, including James's organisation, that have, successfully making that transition, very competently. but it's not just the culture of a more of a B2C service culture, but it's the way that you manage risk, and your shareholders, what their expectation of your business model and your risk profile. So it's not just skills and people, it's whole business model shifting. And for investors, it's a completely different risk profile than 15-year leases. Now, of course, that business, there will still be some of it, but it'll be very interesting to see which landlords can and want to make that shift, and which ones will stay rooted in the more sort of risk averse location. Who's going to make the break first? And I think you can get caught in the middle. It could be a challenging place to be. So I think there's quite a lot of the challenges for these incumbent traditional landlords to make the shift to hotel models. And tech will be part of that, and people will be part of that, but there's investor appetite as well.
It's a different business model. Have you seen tangible cases of property companies retraining staff to bring about hospitality?
My one example, I think it's sort of another topic, is moving from a for sale residential business to a build to rent business, and having to sort of rather just sort of sell to customers and then hand over the keys and thank you very much, here's a number to call if you've got a defect. Suddenly your business model is more of a hotel where the rental is performance is ongoing, all these same issues, right? You suddenly have a relationship with an end customer, and having to build that capability and the tech that supports that, and the culture and the different risk profiling and the capital investments are all different, and therefore your funding models are all different. So it was a big shift, right? And you look at how many residential businesses are successfully making the change to build to rent, with doing asset management as well. There's not many, right? It's new incumbents coming in, quite a lot from the States, and new startups. The traditional residential builders are not really making that change. Now, what will we see with the office world?
Jonathan, as well, taking that one step further, you touched on it already, it's a different risk profile for the investors behind it, isn't it? And of course, depending on how that funding is structured, when you've got bank finance and debt finance in there, we've seen it in previous times in the financial crash, when people had to turn to more flexible approaches, even just to let office space. Some funders and lenders, and in particular banks, weren't willing, potentially rightly or wrongly, to back the same team, but to do a totally different skill set. So there's knock-on effects all the way through, right to the end result, even to a bank loan.
And we're seeing, retail now, some of those investors and debt providers having to take that jump because the values have dropped to sort of 40-50%, and they have no choice but to transform and accept different model. We're not there on offices.
Yeah.
Sadly, I also think it's an opportunity as much as it's a sad opportunity, really, is that in the hospitality sector, clearly they've had the worst of any lockdown of anybody. And actually, I think if there's an opportunity for those people to help them retrain and to use those skills in those spaces, that's really it, because I really fear for the human capital and loss of those jobs in the market, and it really, really does bother me about the long-term viability and vitality of our cities and towns where we live. So
James, I think
that something happens. I
think the other opportunity is a competitive one, and I think that Hilton start offering office space and compete against the traditional office. So I actually think their challenges in their business model may let them think about the skills they have to come and compete in the office model.
That's quite true. Equally, I think you see it. You already saw it in America before lockdown with people like Industrious repurposing out-of-town shopping malls because people could drive to them and park, and they had the gym and the facilities that were there. Could I see Brent Cross becoming quite a big flexible work centre for North London? Yeah, I could. I absolutely could. I don't see that, because sadly, people aren't taking that surface transport, they are prepared to drive, and driving to Brent Cross doesn't seem so bad as driving into the West End.
Then you should buy some Hamersham shares because they're quite cheap at the moment. Not that I can recommend that at all.
Lend us a £5.
So I've got a question from the audience, and we're actually running out of time, so I'll take this one, and I'll encourage anyone else from the audience who's got a question to use the Q&A box to send in any questions. So this one's for you, Jonathan. It says, on Jonathan's point that buildings have been built to sell, not for ongoing management, how do we encourage developers to build thinking with just the long-term operational performance and not just returns?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was quite a bold statement, but there are obviously many responsible office developers who take a long-term interest in there because they're investing in them as well. But I think it's more about, another way to think about it is the whole sort of construction and sort of design community, particularly offices. I think it's moving on residential. I still think about the offices being one-offs. It's the spaceship that will get you to the moon, but it won't go twice. And I think the idea of starting to think about increasing like this as a manufactured product and more about the services that are going within it, right? Don't worry so much about the physicality of it. What can it do? How can it adapt? How does it work for people? That sort of thinking about the building design and how it's put together, I think, starts to lead you to thinking about the customer first. So it's one on from, James, where James has been thinking about the consumer. There's still baggage with the construction and design industries that everyone wants to be a sort of a hero, and these are one-off problems and one-off, and so the more the manufactured thinking, the componentization, the digital design, all about moving through from a development phase and thinking about how it's going to perform, how it's going to adapt to people. So I think it flows through from the brief of the developer and that part of the industry.
Thank you. So we have time just for one more round, and we'll wrap up because it's been an hour, and I think that's enough for people's attention span. So any final comments from each of you? It's an open-ended one. Share your last and kind of parting views on where you think the office sector is going in terms of trends. And we're in 5 years from now, when we've hopefully, knock on wood, come out of this pandemic, we're in a post-pandemic, post-vaccine world. How will the office sector look different? And what are some of the trends that we're seeing today that will come out of the fringes and be at the forefront 5 years from now? Each of you can have a go.
Shall I kick off? I'm going to go with what I would like it to look like.
Yes.
So I don't know if it will happen, but from the human capital point of view and driving space that will really, use this dreadful pandemic, but for the benefits of society going forward, to have the kind of space that would enable people to maintain their well-being or facilitate space so they can do that for themselves, to be productive and to be motivated, and most of all stay connected to their business and their team, regardless of whether they're actually in the office or not. I would foresee an office market which is more fragmented, but in the way of different service offerings, absolutely including the traditional HQ type office that we've seen, some long leases around, a whole chunk of space in the middle which are medium flexibility, a whole chunk of space which is short-term, agile and flexible, but laced throughout with tech which enables that sense of staying connected, so that on a particular day it doesn't really matter whether you're in the office, traveling for work, or at home, you can reach your team easily and transparently.
Thank you, Victoria. So who wants to go next? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being aspirational. So feel free to push the boundaries.
I don't mind going next. I think it's going to look not that similar to the way it looked a year ago. I think that there will still be people getting to grips with how they've incorporated and put in that tech, and there'll be people that are starting to pull away with that point. And the reason why in 5 years it wouldn't be drastically different is because I think real estate is still essentially slow, and those events may come more quickly, but it's still going to happen quite slowly. I think the future skyline of London in 10 years' time probably won't look that significantly different today, certainly not as different as it did 10 years ago. And I think the fear over the pandemic will be replaced with the fear over the growth of AI and big data, and the effect that's going to have on people's jobs. But saying all of that, I think we will have learned a lot more about what makes people work, and I'm always optimistic that we'll be able to develop into a sustainable future that promotes people's well-being.
Thank you, James.
Well, I'm going to go the other way. I think it's going to be massively different. I agree that the skyline won't be any different because I'm not sure many new office buildings are going to be built for some time. I think that the ecosystems in which people work, the places where they work, will be a very different feel. They're going to be much, more broadly distributed geographically, and in different environments, like like shopping centres, like high streets, mixed in with leisure and retail as well. So they're going to be nooks and crannies, different scales. And the one thing that the successful office will define a successful office is its ability to attract a workforce. Now, they may not come into it every day, they may not come to it every month, but it's somewhere that they want to be associated with. It's a brand they want to be associated with, and it reflects them and their organization's brand. And the tech and where it is and how it's configured and how it adapts and informs is all part of that attracting people.
Thank you. So no hoverboards or time traveling cars.
Definitely no drones.
Tushar, over to you.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to go back to what I described as the unbundled office, where you have the HQ as the central anchor, as Jonathan just described, with a network of distributed spaces that fulfill a particular function, whether that's really an excellent place for quiet desk work, or it's the best place for collaborating with your team, or it's the best place to get that client deal over the line. And I guess we used hotels as an example, but I think another great example is gyms. So if you think about something like Virgin Active as the bundled gym, where you have cardio, weights, swimming pool, fitness classes, yoga, everything under one roof, I think you're going to start to see the Barry's boot camp of the office, where people go and visit a specialist brand in a specialist space to get a particular experience. So I think you're going to see a lot more actually physical office brands start to pop up that offer a specialist experience that people want in the office.
No, super interesting. I'd certainly like to see a Barry's boot camp of the office. So we're out of time now. Thank you, Tushar, for leaving us on that note. I'd like to thank my panelists for sharing their views. It's been a really exciting discussion. And thank you to the audience and to everyone who's attended, and for my Pi Labs team to help put this together. So thank you all, and have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.